Late one stormy night, Henry Lawson, a single dad and former Army medic, is driving home when he spots a police cruiser flipped on its side with flames licking at the wreckage, and without thinking twice, he rushes to help pulling an injured female officer from the burning vehicle. But as he's about to call for backup, she grabs his wrist with surprising strength and whispers, desperately, "Please don't call the station, they will kill us both." And Henry realizes this isn't just a car accident. This is something far more dangerous because the officer Rosalind Pierce is bleeding from a gunshot wound, not from the crash, and she's clutching a blood-soaked flash drive like her life depends on it, which it does. And as Henry drags her to safety, his military instincts kick in, telling him that whoever shot this cop is still out there watching, waiting. And what he doesn't know yet is that this single act of heroism is about to drag him and his young daughter into a web of police corruption, drug trafficking, and a conspiracy so deep that it connects to the mysterious death of his wife 2 years ago. And the flash drive Rosalind is protecting contains evidence that could bring down half the police force, including the chief himself. But it also contains something else, a folder labeled Operation Halo, that hints at something even more sinister than anyone could imagine. And now, with dirty cops closing in and nowhere safe to run, Henry must use every skill he learned in combat to protect his daughter, uncover the truth about his wife's death, and help Rosalind expose the conspiracy before they both end up dead and buried like so many others who tried to stand up to the corruption. And the clock is ticking because the people behind this have unlimited resources, unlimited reach, and they've already proven they're willing to kill anyone who gets in their way, including innocent families. And the deeper Henry digs, the more he realizes that his wife's fatal car accident 2 years ago might not have been an accident at all. Henry Lawson gripped the steering wheel tighter as rain hammered against the windshield of his old pickup truck, turning the road ahead into a blur of darkness and water, and the wipers were fighting a losing battle against the downpour that had started an hour ago, turning his usual 20-minute drive home into a treacherous crawl through flooding streets. And he was exhausted after a double shift at the warehouse where he worked stacking boxes and loading trucks to make ends meet ever since his wife Sarah died 2 years ago, leaving him alone to raise their 7-year-old daughter Emma. And he was thinking about Emma, now hoping Mrs. Chen, the elderly neighbor who watched her after school, had managed to get her to bed on time, when suddenly his headlights caught something on the road ahead, making his heart jump into his throat, because there, about 50 yards ahead, a police cruiser was flipped on its side with the front end crumpled against a telephone pole, and smoke or maybe steam was rising from the hood, mixing with the rain, and Henry's military training kicked in immediately as he slammed on the brakes and pulled over to the shoulder, and he was already reaching for his phone to dial 911 when he saw the flames, small at first, but growing rapidly, as they licked along the undercarriage of the damaged vehicle, and without thinking he threw open his door and ran toward the wreck, his shoes splashing through puddles as rain soaked through his jacket within seconds. And as he got closer, he could see someone inside the cruiser. A figure slumped against the driver's side window, and the flames were getting bigger now, feeding on something, probably gasoline leaking from the ruptured tank, and Henry knew he had maybe 30 seconds before the whole thing went up. So he grabbed the door handle, which was now facing upward since the car was on its side, and he pulled with all his strength, but it wouldn't budge, and the person inside wasn't moving, and panic surged through him as he looked around for something to break the window, and he spotted a large rock near the telephone pole, so he grabbed it and smashed it against the passenger window once, twice, 3 times, until the safety glass finally spiderwebbed and gave way, and he cleared the remaining shards with his jacket-covered hand and climbed onto the side of the cruiser and peered inside, where he could now see the driver more clearly, and it was a woman. A police officer with dark hair matted with blood, and her eyes were closed, and for a terrible moment, Henry thought he was too late. But then he saw her chest rise and fall just barely, and new determination flooded through him as he reached down into the vehicle and grabbed her under the arms and started pulling her up and out. And she was heavier than she looked with all her gear, the vest and belt and radio, and he had to brace his feet against the car frame to get leverage. And all the while the flames were growing brighter, hotter, and he could feel the heat now against his face, and finally he managed to drag her free of the wreckage, and he jumped down from the cruiser, pulling her with him. And they both tumbled to the wet pavement, and Henry didn't stop. He grabbed her again and dragged her away from the vehicle as fast as he could, and they'd barely made it 15 feet when there was a loud whooshing sound, and the cruiser erupted into flames that lit up the night sky, turning the raindrops into falling embers, and Henry kept dragging the officer until they were a safe distance away near his truck, and only then did he stop and lay her down carefully on the ground. And he was breathing hard, his hands shaking from adrenaline as he knelt beside her and started checking for injuries, the way he'd been trained to do during his 6 years as an Army medic. And that's when he saw the blood, so much blood soaking through her uniform shirt, on the right side just below her ribs. And this wasn't from the crash. This was a gunshot wound, and his mind raced trying to make sense of it as he pressed his hand against the wound to slow the bleeding, and the officer's eyes suddenly snapped open, and she gasped and grabbed his wrist with surprising strength for someone who'd just been pulled from a burning car, and her eyes were wide and filled with fear as she stared up at him, and she whispered hoarsely, "Please don't call the station." And Henry frowned, confused, as he kept pressure on her wound, and he said, "Ma'am, you're hurt badly. I need to get you help." And she shook her head violently and said, "No, you don't understand. They'll kill us both." And Henry felt ice water run down his spine as he looked at this injured officer, this woman who should be asking him to call for backup, to get her fellow officers to help her. But instead she was begging him not to. And he said, "Who will kill us? Who did this to you?" And she coughed, and blood flecked her lips as she said, "The department, it's corrupted. They shot me. They ran me off the road." And Henry's military instincts were screaming at him now, because this woman wasn't delirious. She was terrified, and he made a split-second decision. That would change everything as he said, Okay, I won't call them, but I need to get you somewhere safe. You're losing too much blood." And she nodded weakly and reached into her vest with a trembling hand and pulled out a small flash drive that was smeared with her blood, and she pressed it into his palm and whispered, "This is everything, the evidence you have to keep it safe." And Henry closed his fist around the drive and nodded as he said, "I will, I promise. But right now, we need to move." And he carefully lifted her into his arms, grunting with the effort, and carried her to his truck, and laid her across the back seat, and covered her with an emergency blanket he kept there. And all the while his mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do, because he couldn't take her to a hospital. They'd report the gunshot wound, and if what she said was true, the corrupt cops would find her and finish the job. And he couldn't take her home because Emma was there, and he wouldn't put his daughter in danger, but he had one place he could go, his brother's hunting cabin, about 30 miles outside of town, deep in the woods where nobody would think to look. And so he made another decision and climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine and pulled back onto the road, leaving the burning police cruiser behind them. And as he drove, he kept glancing in the rearview mirror at the officer who was drifting in and out of consciousness. And he said, "Hang on, just hang on, we'll get you somewhere safe." And she mumbled something he couldn't quite hear, and he pressed harder on the accelerator as the rain continued to pour down. And 20 minutes later, they were on a dirt road that wound through dense forest, and the cabin came into view, a small wooden structure with a covered porch that his brother used during hunting season, but was empty now. And Henry pulled up as close as he could and killed the engine and ran around to get the officer, and she was barely conscious, now her skin pale and clammy. And he lifted her again and carried her inside the cabin, which smelled of old wood and dust. And he laid her on the couch and turned on the battery-powered lantern they kept there since the cabin had no electricity. And in the yellow light, he could see just how bad her condition was, and he knew he had to work fast. So he grabbed the first aid kit from the cabin's closet and his own trauma kit that he always kept in his truck from his Army days. And he cut away her uniform shirt to expose the wound. And it was bad. The bullet had entered just below her rib cage on the right side, and he couldn't see an exit wound, which meant the bullet was still inside, and that was beyond his ability to fix here. But what he could do was clean the wound packet with gauze and bandage it tight to slow the bleeding and give her IV fluids from his trauma. get to help with the blood loss and antibiotics to prevent infection. And so, he worked quickly and efficiently, his hands steady now as years of training took over, and he'd done this dozens of times in the field, treating wounded soldiers in far worse conditions than this. And after about 40 minutes, he'd done everything he could, and the officer was stable, at least for now. Her breathing more regular and the bleeding stopped for the moment, and he sat back on his heels exhausted, and looked at her for the first time, and she was probably in her mid-30s with strong features and dark hair that was now matted with sweat and blood, and there was a name tag on her vest that read, Pierce, and he wondered who she was and what she'd stumbled into that was so dangerous her own department wanted her dead. And as if sensing his thoughts, her eyes fluttered open, and she looked at him and whispered, "Thank you." And Henry gave her a small smile and said, "You're welcome, Officer Pierce. Now you need to rest." And she shook her head slightly and said, "Call me Rosalind." And Henry said, "Okay, Rosalind, I'm Henry." And she nodded. And then her eyes closed again and she drifted off into an exhausted sleep, and Henry stood up and walked to the window and looked out at the dark forest and the rain that was finally starting to let up. And he thought about Emma at home, safe with Mrs. Chen. And he knew he needed to call and let them know he'd be late, but he couldn't explain why, and he pulled out his phone and saw he had no signal out here, which was probably for the best. And he looked down at the blood-covered flash drive in his hand and wondered what secrets it contained that were worth killing for. And he knew that come morning he'd have to find out, because whether he liked it or not, he was now part of whatever this was, and there was no going back. The next morning, Henry woke to sunlight streaming through the cabin windows and the sound of birds chirping outside, and for a moment he forgot where he was, but then he saw Rosalind still lying on the couch, her chest rising and falling steadily, and it all came rushing back, and he stood up from the chair where he'd dozed off and walked over to check on her, and she was awake, her eyes tracking him as he approached, and he said, "How are you feeling?" And she said, "Like I got shot and then crashed a car, but alive thanks to you." And Henry allowed himself a small smile as he said, "That's good. Let me check your bandages," and he carefully lifted the gauze and was relieved to see the wound wasn't bleeding anymore, though it was red and inflamed, and he applied more antibiotic ointment and fresh bandages and said, "You're lucky the bullet didn't hit anything vital, but you need a real doctor." And she shook her head firmly and said, "No doctors, they'll report it. And then I'm dead." And Henry sighed because he knew she was right, and he said, "Okay, then you need to tell me what's going on. Who shot you and why?" And Rosalind struggled to sit up, and Henry helped her lean against the arm of the couch. And she took a deep breath and began to speak. And what she told him over the next hour made his blood run cold, because according to Rosalind, there was a group of officers in the department, at least a dozen, maybe more, who were running a massive drug operation, and they were confiscating drugs during busts and arrests, but instead of destroying them or logging them as evidence, they were repackaging them and selling them back onto the streets through various dealers and middlemen, and the operation was bringing in millions of dollars. And it went all the way to the top, including the chief of police, Marcus Vaughn, who was the mastermind behind it all. And Rosalind said she'd been investigating it for months, ever since her partner, a good cop named David Mills, started asking questions, and then conveniently died in what was ruled a suicide. But Rosalind knew better, because David wasn't suicidal. He was close to exposing the whole thing. And so she picked up where he left off, and she'd been secretly collecting evidence, video recordings from tampered body cameras, financial records showing suspicious payments, witness testimonies from dealers who were willing to talk, and she'd compiled it all on the flash drive. And she was planning to take it to the FBI, to federal investigators who couldn't be bought, but somehow the corrupt cops found out. Maybe someone saw her meeting with a witness, or maybe they'd been monitoring her, and last night they came for her. And she said, "I was at home when I got a call from dispatch saying there was an emergency at an address across town, and I should respond immediately." And I went, but it was a trap, and when I got there, 3 officers were waiting, including Detective Ray Hartman, who's one of Vaughn's top enforcers, and they pulled their guns and told me to hand over the evidence, and I ran, got back to my cruiser and tried to drive away, but Hartman shot me through the window, and then they chased me and tried to run me off the road, which they succeeded in doing, and I crashed, and they would have finished me off. But your headlights appeared in the distance, and they must have panicked and left, and that's when you found me." And Henry listened to all this with growing horror, because he'd always thought of the police as the good guys, the people you called when you needed help. But now he was learning that some of them were anything but, and he said, "Why didn't you just turn the evidence over to them?" And she looked at him like he was crazy and said, "Because it would have disappeared, and I would have disappeared along with it. These people don't leave witnesses." Henry and he nodded slowly, understanding, and then he thought of something and said, "You mentioned Operation Halo. What's that?" And Rosalind's expression darkened and she said, "I don't know exactly. I found a folder with that name on one of the computers I hacked into in the department, but it was encrypted and I couldn't break into it. But based on the context, it's something bigger than the drug operation, something that scares even the corrupt cops." And Henry felt a chill run through him, and he said, "Bigger how?" And she said, "I think it involves more than just drugs. I think it's about control, about having leverage over the entire city, government, judges, politicians, business leaders. And I think they're collecting dirt on everyone, blackmail, material to ensure nobody can touch them." And Henry's mind immediately went to Sarah, his wife who died 2 years ago in a car accident, and he'd always accepted it as a tragedy, just bad luck. But now he wondered, and he said, "Rosalind, my wife died 2 years ago in a car crash. The police investigated and ruled it an accident. But is there any chance?" And he couldn't finish the sentence. But Rosalind understood, and she said, "What was her name?" And Henry said, "Sarah Lawson," and Rosalind's eyes widened in recognition, and she said, "Oh God, Henry, I'm so sorry." And he felt his stomach drop and said, "You know something, don't you?" And Rosalind nodded slowly and said, "Sarah's name is in the files. She was an investigator with the state auditor's office, and she was looking into financial irregularities in the police department's budget, millions of dollars, that couldn't be accounted for, and according to the notes I found, she was getting close to discovering where the money was going. And then she died and the investigation was dropped." And Henry felt like the ground had been pulled out from under him, because he'd spent 2 years believing Sarah's death was just a horrible accident, that she'd lost control of her car on a rainy night and crashed into a concrete barrier. But now he was learning it might have been murder, that she might have been killed by the very people who were supposed to protect the public, and rage burned through him hot and fierce. And he stood up abruptly and said, "Those bastards, they killed her, didn't they?" And Rosalind said, "I think so, yes, I'm sorry." And Henry paced the room, his hands clenched into fists as he tried to control the fury and grief that threatened to overwhelm him. And he said, "They took her from me, from Emma. Our daughter was only 5 years old, and they murdered her mother and got away with it." And Rosalind said, "Which is why we need to stop them. Henry, the evidence on that flash drive can bring them all down, but we need to get it to the right people." And Henry stopped pacing and looked at her and said, "The FBI." And she nodded and said, "Yes, I have a contact, an agent named Kate Morrison who specializes in police corruption. She's based out of the regional office about 2 hours from here. And if we can get the evidence to her, she can launch a full investigation." And Henry said, "Okay, then that's what we do. But first I need to make sure my daughter is safe." And Rosalind said, "Where is she now?" And Henry said, "She's at home with our neighbor, but I've been gone all night and they'll be worried, and I need to get her somewhere safe before we make our move." And Rosalind nodded and said, "We'll figure it out. But Henry, we need to be careful. Vaughn and his people will be looking for me, and they'll check everyone I know, including you, since you pulled me from that wreck." And Henry felt another chill because he hadn't thought of that. But she was right, and if they came looking for Rosalind, they'd find out. He helped her, and then Emma would be in danger, and that was unacceptable, and so he said, "We need to move now. Get Emma and get out of town before they connect us." And Rosalind tried to stand but gasped in pain and nearly fell. And Henry caught her and said, You're in no condition to travel, and she said I don't have a choice and neither do you. So help me to your truck and let's go. And Henry hesitated, but he knew she was right, and so he helped her to her feet and supported her as they walked outside to his truck, and the morning sun was bright and warm, and for a moment everything seemed peaceful. But Henry knew that was an illusion, and that somewhere out there, dangerous people were hunting for them. And he helped Rosalind into the passenger seat and then climbed behind the wheel and started the engine. And as they drove back toward town, he called Mrs. Chen from his phone, which now had signal, and she answered on the second ring, sounding worried, and said, "Henry, where have you been? Emma was asking for you this morning," and Henry felt guilt wash over him. But he kept his voice calm and said, "I'm sorry, Mrs. Chen, I had an emergency, but I'm on my way now. Is Emma okay?" And Mrs. Chen said, "Yes, she's fine. She's eating breakfast, but Henry, you sound strange. Is everything all right?" And Henry said, "Everything's fine. I'll be there in 20 minutes, and he hung up before she could ask more questions. And Rosalind said, "You're a good father." And Henry glanced at her and said, "I'm trying to be. It's just me and Emma now, and I won't let anything happen to her." And Rosalind said, "I understand, and Henry will keep her safe, I promise." And Henry hoped she was right, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. And when they reached the outskirts of town, he took back roads, avoiding main streets, and kept checking the mirrors for any sign of police cars. And finally they reached his neighborhood, a quiet street lined with modest houses. And he pulled into his driveway and said, "Stay here. I'll get Emma and throw some things in a bag," and Rosalind nodded. And Henry jumped out and ran to the front door and let himself in. And Mrs. Chen appeared from the kitchen looking relieved and concerned, and she said, "Henry, what's going on? You look terrible." And he forced a smile and said, "I'm fine, just had a rough night at work. Is Emma upstairs?" And Mrs. Chen nodded slowly, still looking suspicious. And Henry said, "Thank you so much for watching her. I need to take her somewhere for a few days, family emergency." And Mrs. Chen's eyes widened and she said, "Is everything okay?" And Henry said, Yes, everything's fine. I'll explain later. But I really need to get going." And he turned and headed upstairs, before she could ask more questions, and he found Emma in her room playing with her dolls. And when she saw him, her face lit up, and she said, "Daddy, you're home." And Henry felt his heart squeeze, and he knelt down and hugged her tight and said, "Hey, sweetheart, I missed you." And she hugged him back and said, "I missed you too. Where were you?" And Henry pulled back and said, "I had to help someone. But now we're going on a little trip, just you and me, for a few days. Doesn't that sound fun?" And Emma's eyes widened with excitement, and she said, "Really, where are we going?" And Henry said, "It's a surprise, but you need to pack some clothes quickly. Can you do that?" And Emma nodded eagerly and started pulling clothes from her dresser and stuffing them into her backpack, and Henry went to his room and did the same, grabbing clothes, toiletries, and also his old service pistol that he kept locked in his nightstand, along with 2 full magazines, and he checked the weapon, made sure it was loaded, and tucked it into his waistband under his jacket. And then he grabbed their bags and ushered Emma downstairs, and Mrs. Chen was waiting at the bottom, looking worried, and she said, "Henry, please tell me what's really going on." And Henry paused because he owed her something, but he couldn't tell her the truth because it would put her in danger, so he said, "I can't explain right now, but please trust me, we'll be fine, and I'll call you when I can." And Mrs. Chen studied his face and then nodded slowly and said, "Be safe, Henry." And he said, "I will thank you for everything." And then he and Emma went outside, and Emma saw Rosalind in the truck and said, "Daddy, who's that?" And Henry said, "That's my friend Rosalind. She's not feeling well, so she's coming with us." And Emma accepted this without question, the way kids do, and climbed into the back seat and buckled herself in. And Henry got behind the wheel and said, "Okay, let's go." And he backed out of the driveway and headed out of the neighborhood, and he was just starting to relax, thinking they'd made it, when he saw flashing lights in his rearview mirror, and his heart jumped into his throat as a police car pulled up behind them and turned on its siren, and Rosalind saw it too and said, "Damn. They found us." And Henry's mind raced, and he said, "What do I do?" And Rosalind said, "Don't stop, keep driving." And Henry said, "But Emma's in the car." And Rosalind said, "Which is why we can't stop, Henry. If they get us, they'll kill us all." And Henry knew she was right. And so he pressed down on the accelerator and the truck lurched forward, and the police car behind them did the same, and Emma said, "Daddy, what's happening? Why aren't we stopping?" And Henry tried to keep his voice calm and said, "It's okay, sweetheart, just a game." And Emma seemed uncertain but didn't protest. And Henry took a sharp right turn onto a side street and then another left, and the police car stayed right behind them. And Henry's military training kicked in. And he said, "Rosalind, how many of them?" And she twisted in her seat to look and said, "Just one car. 2 officers." And Henry said, "Okay, hold on." And he yanked the wheel hard to the right and cut through a parking lot, and then back onto another street, and the police car followed. But he'd gained a little distance, and up ahead he saw the entrance to the highway, and he thought if he could just get there, he could lose them in traffic. And so he pushed the truck harder, and Emma was holding onto her seatbelt looking, scared now, and saying, "Daddy, I don't like this game." And Henry said, "I know, sweetheart, it'll be over soon, I promise." And they reached the highway entrance, and Henry merged into traffic, cutting off a semi-truck that blared its horn, and the police car was still behind them. But now there were other cars between them, and Henry wove through traffic, taking risks he normally never would, and Rosalind said, "Take the next exit. There's a shopping center, we can lose them there." And Henry did as she said, taking the exit at the last possible second, and the police car nearly missed it, but managed to follow, and they were in a busy commercial area now with strip malls and restaurants, and Henry turned into a large parking lot and drove around to the back and pulled behind a loading dock and killed the engine and said, "Everybody stay quiet." And they sat there in tense silence, and Henry could hear his heart pounding in his ears, and Emma was crying softly in the back seat, and he reached back and squeezed her hand and whispered, "It's okay, baby, we're safe." And after what felt like an eternity, the police car drove past the parking lot slowly searching, and then continued on, and Henry let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. And Rosalind said that was too close, and Henry nodded and said, "We can't use my truck anymore. They'll be looking for it." And Rosalind said, "There's a car rental place 2 blocks from here, we can get something there." And Henry said, "Okay, but we need to move fast," and so he started the engine again, and carefully pulled out from behind the loading dock, and drove to the rental place, and he parked, and said, "Emma, sweetheart, you stay here with Rosalind. I'll be right back." And Emma nodded, still sniffling, and Henry went inside and used cash to rent a nondescript sedan, giving a fake name and address, and the clerk didn't ask questions. And 15 minutes later, Henry pulled up in the rental car and transferred their bags and helped Rosalind move from the truck to the sedan, and Emma climbed in back, and Henry left his truck in the lot and drove away. And as they headed out of town, Rosalind said that was smart, using cash and a fake name, and Henry said, "I learned a few things in the army," and she smiled slightly and said, "I'm glad you're on my side," and Henry said so. "Where do we go now?" And Rosalind said, "There's a safe house about an hour from here, a place I set up in case something like this happened. It's off the grid, nobody knows about. Then we can lay low there and contact my FBI contact." And Henry nodded and followed her directions, and they drove in silence for a while, and Emma eventually fell asleep in the back seat, exhausted from the stress and fear, and Henry glanced at Rosalind, who looked pale and tired, and he said, "How are you holding up?" And she said, "I've been better, but I'll make it." And Henry said, "You're tough. I'll give you that." And she said, "I have to be in this job. You don't survive otherwise." And Henry said, "Why did you become a cop?" And Rosalind was quiet for a moment, and then said, "My father was a cop, a good one, and he was killed in the line of duty when I was 10, and I wanted to honor his memory by following in his footsteps and cleaning up the streets like he did. But instead I found out that some of the people wearing the badge are just as bad as the criminals they're supposed to catch, and it's been disillusioning to say the least." And Henry said, "I'm sorry." And she shrugged and said, "It is what it is, but I won't stop fighting, not until every dirty cop is behind bars or dead." And Henry heard the steel in her voice and knew she meant it. And after another hour of driving, they turned onto a dirt road that led deep into the woods. And eventually they came to a small cabin similar to his brother's hunting cabin. And Rosalind said, "This is it." And Henry parked and helped her inside while carrying Emma, who was still asleep, and he laid Emma on a bed in the small bedroom and covered her with a blanket, and then joined Rosalind in the main room, and she was sitting at a table with a laptop that had been hidden in the cabin, and she said, "I need to get this flash drive uploaded and sent to Agent Morrison. But first, let's see what we've got." And Henry sat down next to her, and she plugged the flash drive into the laptop, and after a moment files began to appear on the screen, hundreds of them, and Rosalind opened a folder labeled Body Cam Footage and clicked on a video file. And what Henry saw made his stomach turn, because it showed two police officers standing in an evidence room, and one of them was removing bags of drugs from a locker and replacing them with fake bags filled with something else, probably baking, soda or flour, and the other officer was standing guard, and they were laughing and joking like it was no big deal. And then the video cut to another scene, showing officers conducting a traffic stop and planting drugs in a suspect's car, and then arresting him for possession. And Henry said, "This is unbelievable." And Rosalind said, "This is just the tip of the iceberg." And she opened another folder, and this one contained financial records showing wire transfers from various offshore accounts to personal bank accounts belonging to police officers and city officials, including Chief Vaughn, who had received over $3 million in the past 2 years. And Henry said, "How is this even possible? How did they hide this for so long?" And Rosalind said, "Because they control the system, Henry. They're the ones who investigate complaints. They're the ones who review evidence. They're the ones who decide what gets reported and what gets buried. And unless someone from the outside steps in, they're untouchable." And Henry said, "Until now," and Rosalind nodded and said, "Until now." And then she opened the folder labeled Operation Halo, and her expression changed to one of shock and horror. And Henry said, "What is it?" And Rosalind didn't answer. She just stared at the screen, and Henry looked and saw dozens of files containing photos and documents, and he clicked on one at random, and it showed a judge, a respected judge in the city, accepting an envelope of cash from Chief Vaughn, and another photo showed a city councilman in a hotel room with a woman who was clearly not his wife, and another showed a businessman being blackmailed over evidence of tax fraud, and Henry said, "They're blackmailing everyone." And Rosalind said, "Yes, this is how they maintain control. They have dirt on everyone who matters. And if anyone tries to cross them, they release the information and destroy that person's life and career." And Henry felt sick because this was so much bigger than he'd imagined, and he said, "What do we do?" And Rosalind said, "We send everything to Agent Morrison. She'll know what to do," and she started typing an email, explaining everything and attaching the files. And Henry said, "Will she believe us?" And Rosalind said she will. "I've worked with her before, and she's one of the good ones." And after several minutes, Rosalind hit send and said, "Okay, it's done now, we wait." And Henry said, "How long?" And Rosalind said, "Hopefully not long, but we need to be ready, because once Vaughn finds out we sent the evidence, he'll come for us with everything he's got." And Henry said, "Then we need to be ready to fight." And Rosalind looked at him and said, "You don't have to do this, Henry. You've already done more than enough. You should take Emma and disappear, start over somewhere safe." And Henry shook his head and said, "No. They killed my wife, and they nearly killed you, and God knows how many others. I'm not running, I'm seeing this through." And Rosalind studied him for a long moment, and then nodded and said, "Okay, then we fight together." And Henry said, "Together." And they sat there in the quiet cabin waiting for a response from Agent Morrison and hoping they'd live long enough to see justice done. And outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows through the trees, and Henry thought about Sarah, about how she'd died trying to do the right thing, and he made a silent promise to her that he would finish what she started, and he would make sure the people who killed her paid for what they'd done, no matter what it cost him. And as darkness fell, Emma woke up and came into the main room, rubbing her eyes, and said, "Daddy, I'm hungry." And Henry smiled and said, "Okay, sweetheart, let's find you something to eat." And he went to the small kitchen and found some canned soup and crackers and heated it up for her, and they ate together at the table. And Emma seemed to sense that something serious was happening because she was quieter than usual, and she said, "Daddy, are we in trouble?" And Henry looked at his daughter, this beautiful, brave little girl, who'd already lost so much, And he said, no, sweetheart, we're not in trouble. We're helping someone. And Emma said, the lady who's hurt. And Henry nodded and said, yes. Her name is Rosalind, and she's a police officer, and some bad people are trying to hurt her, and we're keeping her safe. And Emma thought about this and then said, like a superhero. And Henry smiled and said, yeah, exactly like a superhero. And Emma seemed satisfied with this and finished her soup and then went back to the bedroom to play. And Rosalind said, she's a good kid. And Henry said, she's everything to me. And Rosalind nodded and said, I can tell. And Henry said, do you have any family? And Rosalind shook her head and said, no, my mom died when I was young, and my dad, like I said, was killed on duty. And I never married, never had kids. I guess I was always too focused on the job. And Henry said, it's not too late. And Rosalind smiled sadly and said, maybe. If I survive this. And Henry said, you will, we both will. And just then the laptop chimed, indicating a new email. And Rosalind quickly opened it, and her face lit up, and she said, it's from Morrison. She got the files, and she's launching an immediate investigation. She's sending federal agents to the city tomorrow to start making arrests. And Henry felt a surge of relief and hope and said, so it's over. And Rosalind said, almost. But we still need to stay hidden until the arrests are made, because Vaughn will be desperate once he finds out. And desperate people are dangerous. And Henry nodded understanding and said, how long until the feds move in? And Rosalind said, Morrison says they'll be ready by tomorrow afternoon. They need time to coordinate and get warrants. But Henry, we did it. We actually did it. And Henry allowed himself a small smile and said, Sarah would be proud. And Rosalind said she would be. And Henry felt tears prick his eyes, but he blinked them away because this wasn't over yet, and he couldn't let his guard down. And as if to prove his point, there was a sudden sound outside the cabin, the crunch of tires on gravel, and both Henry and Rosalind froze and looked at each other. And Henry said, did you tell anyone about this place? And Rosalind shook her head and said, no one. And Henry's heart began to race, and he said, stay here. And he pulled out his pistol and moved to the window and peered out, and in the fading light, he could see 3 cars pulling up outside, black SUVs with tinted windows, and Henry said, we've got company. And Rosalind struggled to her feet and said, damn, they must have tracked my laptop somehow. And Henry said, can they do that? And Rosalind said, if they have the right tech, yes. And Henry cursed and said, we need to go now. And he ran to the bedroom and grabbed Emma, who looked scared, and said, Daddy, what's happening? And Henry said, we're playing hide-and-seek, sweetheart, and we need to be very quiet. Okay? And Emma nodded, and Henry carried her back to the main room where Rosalind was gathering the laptop and flash drive. And Henry said, is there a back way out? And Rosalind nodded and said, through the kitchen. There's a door that leads to the woods. And Henry said, go. I'll hold them off. And Rosalind said, Henry, no. And he said, go, I'll be right behind you, I promise. And Rosalind hesitated, but then nodded and limped toward the kitchen. And Henry moved to the front door and took a deep breath, and then kicked it open and fired 2 shots into the air. And the men outside who were approaching the cabin immediately dove for cover behind their vehicles and started returning fire, and bullets tore through the cabin's walls, splintering wood and shattering windows. And Henry ducked and ran toward the kitchen where Rosalind was helping Emma out the back door. And Henry followed them into the dark woods, and behind them, he could hear men shouting and crashing through the cabin. And they ran as fast as they could, Rosalind leaning to Henry for support, and Emma holding his hand. And the forest was dark and dense, and they stumbled over roots and rocks, but they kept going, and behind them flashlights bobbed and voices called out, and Henry knew they were being hunted. And after what felt like forever, they came to a small stream, and Henry said, we need to cross it, might throw off their trail. And they waded through the cold water, Emma on Henry's shoulders, and came out on the other side and kept running. And finally they came to a road, and Henry said, we need to find a car. And as if in answer to a prayer, headlights appeared in the distance, and Henry flagged down the vehicle, which turned out to be an old pickup truck, driven by an elderly farmer. And Henry said, please, sir, we need help. And the farmer looked at them. This man covered in mud, carrying a child and supporting an injured woman. And he said, get in.